Guys, welcome to our second webinar of the series we're running today. Today we're going to talk about security and privacy of COVID-driven tech applications. I'd like to welcome back Dani Storey of CyQIQ, Nicole Stephensen of Ground Up Consulting, and Lani Refiti of IoTSec Australia. Welcome, guys, and thanks for joining us again. So the world's changed again a little bit since we last spoke, so it's a good chance to talk a bit about the challenges around that. So COVID-driven tech applications, lots of stuff in the news. Who's going to kick us off? Nicole, you suggested this. You suggested this topic. So why don't you give us an introduction?
Yeah. Okay. Look, I think this is a really unique time in our history because we have this need on the part of governments to be responsive and very quickly to what's happening in terms of public health. And it's not just about, the usual suspects that we're seeing in terms of, say, contact tracing in relation to COVID-19. We're talking now about things like, well, how do we manage day-to-day business, and how do we ensure that people can get out and about in the community? How do we take care of mental health? Now, our governments have a real opportunity here to jump on this quickly, but in order to do that, in many cases, they're needing to perhaps enter into public-private partnerships with our tech providers or platform developers. And that presents some really unique security and privacy challenges, I think, from the perspective of both the community as well as what our governments are required to do under various privacy laws and standards. So I hope that sets the scene a little bit for us now, Ross.
Yes. I mean, as a layman who has nothing to do with security and privacy domain and someone that sees the news, and I consider myself a relatively well-balanced individual, I think the governments across the board are doing a great job in difficult circumstances. And I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories and challenges around technology, but how are things behind the scenes? I'll leave that open to the floor.
I'll jump in there. I think I agree with you. This is an unprecedented sort of pandemic that has required sort of unprecedented responses, right? I mean, we're just talking this morning about Victoria and their lockdowns, and only just starting to come out of it. And then I think if we dovetail that back into the technology applications of either sensors or applications that help contact tracing, I think if you put your privacy hat on, if you were going to design something that was going to put privacy at risk, it would be the type of technology that you would use, right? Because you've got location data, you've got identification, tracking movement, etc. And so I guess the ethical concerns are obviously around users being tracked, but it's not a zero-sum game, and I think that's what I've seen over the last 5 months, is people will either jump in the it tracks location and identity, so that's bad, we can't use it. And on the other hand, people are saying, well, it's going to help contact tracers do their jobs and help sort of minimize the spread of COVID, so that's good, everyone should use it. So unfortunately, that's where I've seen the argument, either other ends. There really hasn't been a nuanced enough discussion to look at the risk and reward. And I think that whether you're talking cybersecurity or privacy, at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. Well, what are the risks, but what are the rewards if we do get 70, 80% of the population using this type of technology?
I think to that point, Lani, this was in a very different context some years ago, but I had a conversation around security and privacy, and it was in relation to sort of social media and smart homes and things. And I guess my summary of it all was, when people get more out of doing it their way than not, then the privacy seems to get put by the wayside, and they're happy to accept the benefit or whatever that they got from it. In this, I think we're talking about net benefit for, a country or a community, and that's more individual natures, not so much driving that decision. So I think adoption would be more challenging in that sort of environment. But I mean, just this morning, I saw the news around the COVID Safe app, and apparently for the 7 million downloads that they've had, they've only actually managed to trace 14 cases. which is obviously not great given the number of cases we've had. And again, that might be that the people in the regions that have had the most cases don't have the app, which I'd say is fairly unlikely, or the technology is not really reliable enough to give them the results that they need, or any number of different things there. And I think particularly in other states, I'm not sure if every state's doing this, but registering when you go to a cafe and providing your name and phone number and address or whatever you have to provide to get a seat at a table. My concerns actually are more around how those bits of information are handled, particularly when they're scribbled on a bit of paper, because I suspect in a lot of cases they're probably chucked in the bin or put into a filing cabinet. And the industries that normally don't have to deal with those sensitive types of information. And if they do, it's through an application that they purchase from a vendor who does manage, say, the credit card transaction or what have you. So I think we've got a kind of a really unique combination of the types of people that are using these technologies, the level of governance that they've had or lack thereof, and also, of course, the technology itself. So I think it's quite a complicated challenge, obviously.
No, you're right, Dani. I mean, the hospitality industry, retail industries that don't ordinarily, deal with that level of sort of PII in terms of identifiable information. You're right, and from Nicole, and you probably know this more than we do, but I read somewhere that the information that's actually gathered through those means don't actually fall under personal information under the Privacy Act. I did read that somewhere in terms of the data that's collected by the COVID Safe app is, and regardless of where it goes to, state authorities, etc., it's treated as such. But I did read somewhere that the information that is gathered through other means, whether it's scribbled on a piece of paper, etc., is not considered to be personal information and covered under the Privacy Act.
Okay, so I think there's two things, right? The way that the COVID Safe app data is collected and managed needs to be done in accordance with Australia's Privacy Act. And there was a big body of legislative work that was done just at the time when that app was rolled out, which is great. And I had the privilege of being part of a group of privacy professionals that provided advice to the Attorney General's Department on that, in terms of how we would keep that data safe once the app collected it, and making sure that only the relevant health authorities for the relevant purpose were accessing it and using it. The other thing, though, this idea of checking in or contact tracing out in the business community, that's a different kettle of fish, because a number of those businesses are considered small businesses.
Correct.
And what that means is that their operations and the information that they gather and the stuff that's personal amongst that information is not automatically protected in terms of the Privacy Act. That's a bit scary, right? If you think that the hairdressers, the pubs, some of the clubs, some of the shops, the various different cottage industries that are around our neighborhoods, where people are, really just making ends meet barely right now during this time. In order to have people in their doors, they have to have some kind of a COVID safe plan, and that plan involves collecting the data of you and me when we walk in. Now, because they're not often anyway captured under the privacy law by virtue of their annual turnover, so it has to be more than $3 million, or they have to be collecting health information. And we can't really say, because they're not asking when we check in, are you feeling well today? Which would be our health information. Instead, what they're saying is, if you don't feel well, don't check in, don't come here. So the data that's being captured doesn't really fall under the Privacy Act. It presents a real issue then for these companies, these businesses, to be able to manage their record keeping properly, understand what their security obligations are and their privacy obligations. And there seems to be kind of no rhyme or reason to how that's happening. One place that I think is actually doing it quite well is the New South Wales government. So they've rolled out a check-in app across New South Wales. So your businesses, your government agencies, et cetera, can use this one app. And there's a level of standardization there, right, in terms of how people check in, what data is collected at the time they check in, and how that information is then made available to health authorities if it's needed. I like that idea. I like that there's a more consistent approach there. Whereas here in Queensland, even here in Ipswich, where I'm based, I provided advice through the Chamber of Commerce to businesses in this town around their record keeping obligations and what kinds of things they could do to keep personal information safe. But not everyone's doing the same thing. Even though I went, through a large body of work with the Chamber of Commerce to push this information out there to the business community, I would say only maybe a third of those businesses are actually following that prescriptive advice.
But I think on that point as well, I mean, again, from a layman's perspective and a user, I've used QR code apps in multiple restaurants and bars. Not that I'm in bars too often, but every time it's inputting fresh information in. So I don't know whether that's a sign that they're different providers, but also when I've been in different places. So kind of here around the sort of Maroochydore area, I'm seeing relatively lax adoption of the rules. But then I was up in Hervey Bay a few weeks ago, and every restaurant there, I was having to write down the children's names, everything in great detail. And that was probably 3 different venues I went to. So I think that just shows how perhaps the councils that are in charge of finding people, how strict and stringent they are as well. So it's not just necessarily the organisations, but the councils and whoever's making sure those rules are followed.
Mm. And what I also find interesting is that if you look on a global scale, right, because it's not just Australia that's doing this, sort of COVID safe type applications. There are a lot of other countries. I think it was at last count 40 or so countries that have sort of embarked on this with sort of differing levels of success. And I always find it interesting that it's the countries where privacy may not, be top of the list, where you get the 70%, 80% sort of rollout when you make it mandatory. But again, then there's a lot of sort of human rights questions that are asked, in those environments. But if you look at the EU, I think they've had sort of varying success in terms of the rollout of such technologies, and the EU is sort of the bastion of privacy, or it's looked at, particularly that's where the GDPR sort of regulation was birthed out of. So I think even globally, it's not just limited to Australia or Queensland or New South Wales. I think globally, governments have sort of struggled to come out with a cohesive sort of strategy, but even and also around the technology that's being used, the data that's being collected, etc.
I think on that point, Lani, because I've been doing a bit of research on European uptake, because it's quite close to my heart. So the UK, I think we've had about 14 million downloads. And I think it's a big cultural, it's about the culture of the country as well. So Germany, who are probably quite trusting of their government, or seems quite trusting as their government, they've seen 18 million downloads recently. France, that's very much very, very socialist and very about freedom and people's rights. I think they've just relaunched the app because they'd only had about 3 million downloads in a population of over 60 million. So very much about how the people believe in the government. But there was also a big argument, I think, I don't know how pertinent it is to privacy, but there was a big argument in the media and around centralized versus decentralized data collection. And that seemed to be a big block for many people rolling out apps. I don't know if that's something you guys have seen.
Yeah, no, I have seen that. I mean, the Australian one is that more of the centralized model. And this is where a lot of the distrust of the government, or of any level, whether it's local, state, or federal, comes in. And I would say you are right to be skeptical. Government hasn't always been very good at controlling access to the data that it collects from its citizens. There's been a number of breaches in the Australian federal government. And even if you look at New South Wales, Service New South Wales was breached not long ago. It must have been a couple of months or 3 months ago by what's thought to be a nation-state attacker. Service New South Wales, the department that got breached. And so that centralized option, yes, yeah. So but even the decentralized option has challenges. I mean, no sort of implementation of technology exists without some sort of inherent risk. And so even if you look at the decentralized option, which is where they try and obviously anonymize the identification of the user from being collected centrally. They'll usually use something like Bluetooth on your phone to detect those around you, and your information is stored locally on your phone, and it usually has a sort of 1 to 2 week period where the info is kept. The challenges there, if you're a government, is that it's obviously still much harder for you to do contact tracing, and really you're only notifying each other that you've been in contact with someone who has had COVID. So there are varying degrees of success with both approaches. So yeah, there is no, and again, it's much like anything, there is no silver bullet. There is always risk and reward as you go down a particular path.
I was just going to mention before, Lani, when you were talking about data and centralization, that I guess that's one of my challenges with this. Write your name and phone number on a piece of paper at your local cafe. I mean, I haven't experienced that yet because I haven't been to a cafe. I'm being in Melbourne, but there's nothing that's going to confirm that I am who I say I am. There's nothing that's going to confirm that my number is correct. And one would hope that if someone had COVID at the cafe, that I'd probably want to know about it. But I think there's also a lot of people, that don't want to know, and also just want to go about their life. And if they think they might have, like, for example, if they think they might have been in contact with someone, you go get tested. If you get tested, you have to stay home. There's a number of people, I would believe, that just haven't gone and got tested because they don't want to stay home. And then we've had people running around the community, visiting shops and cafes and things. And all of a sudden now we've got outbreaks because somebody didn't get tested. Whilst I don't think we want to force people to go and get tested, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but the same argument has turned up around vaccines and things. Just yesterday, actually, Dan Andrews was talking about, COVID normal is going to be the way we live until such time as there's a vaccine. Well, that becomes the government's next challenge, because unless it's mandatory, not everybody's going to get the vaccine, in which case we'll still have COVID. So I don't want to deal with that problem today, because I think there's a whole different argument and rabbit hole there. But what I'm sort of getting at is, without starting to impact people's freedoms, you can't force the behaviour you want, even when it's in the interests of the community. And, I think in many ways, I would really love if people could just perhaps think a bit bigger than themselves. But it's very idealistic in nature, and I'm aware that that's not how everybody is. But I also kind of understand why so many conspiracy theories and conspiracy theories and those sorts of things are coming out, because there are a lot of things going on in the world that do look a bit unusual, and it's really just fueling that fear that people inherently have. So there's this kind of arguments either way for sort of mandating a behaviour and not. And obviously the adoption levels globally have been influenced by that really important thing that you mentioned around trust.
This isn't the first time we've had a pandemic, though, that has created technology developments and deployments out of necessity. I mean, when I moved to Australia in 2003, we were at sort of the tail end of the SARS epidemic. I'm sure you guys remember this. And leaving Canada to come to Australia required going through the United States, and there were particular gateways you needed to go through in order to board your plane. And one of them was a temperature checking station. And at the time, that was considered, from the perspective of civil libertarians, not a great thing. But in terms of monitoring public health and making sure that sick people from that airport didn't get on a plane and take that disease to another country, that was more important at the time in terms of public policy. So these particular temperature checking gateways were set up. This is kind of no different. It's just bigger. And I see technology has advanced so much since 2003, right? I can't even fathom, how we used to live our lives. Now that we're used to the proliferation of technology, digitization, the ability to communicate and connect the way we do now. So we have an opportunity to use those technologies for public health purposes and to enforce things that our government believes are in the public interest, right? So if you look beyond just contact tracing and the COVID Safe app or the check-in applications or requirements when you're out in the community, there are other things that are being explored by governments now to deal with that issue that you raised, Dani, around like public compliance, this and even care factor, because a number of people in the public who haven't sort of been directly exposed to COVID, or anyone who has, maybe their care factor is a little bit lower. So then the technology comes in to take place of our sort of self-regulation. So you have in some cities around the world already, the CCTV cameras are being enabled with both facial recognition and heat monitoring, so that when people are walking down the street, not only are you getting a picture of their face and knowing who they are, but you can know if they have a fever. Similarly, there's social distance monitoring, again, using cameras to detect who is standing at least 1.5 meters apart and who's not. And if they're not, perhaps sending a police officer to talk to them and to encourage them to regulate their behavior socially. So we're seeing these things, right? And the privacy issues are huge. But also the security issues are quite huge, because what we have now are governments and some private sector entities collecting information about the community in amounts that, and Lani mentioned this before, that we just haven't seen this before, this extent of personal information being collected for one public purpose, or ostensibly to serve one public purpose. Yeah, I find it fascinating and also scary, from the seat that I'm in.
No, I agree, and it's interesting. I had a discussion with someone last week. We had this. We got into this thought exercise, around what could we do with technology to stem COVID if we didn't have any concerns around privacy or security. And we talked exactly of the technologies that you spoke about. If we could do, have CCTV cameras, with thermal sort of sensors on them, and then the use of drones, etc., to monitor, social distancing in crowds, etc., and disperse them where required. And then, 100% of take-up of the COVID-safe contact tracing. I reckon we could pretty much going close to sort of stem the spread of COVID or eliminate it. But obviously, it was a thought exercise. I don't think technology is the issue. I think it comes down to that trust, privacy concerns as well.
Yeah, I mean, you look at cities
what
like,
you mentioned, Lani. I'm sorry.
City-states like
There,
Singapore, go on. They're even rolling out now, not just sort of your COVID safety or public compliance type technologies, but they've also rolled out something really cool called LumaHealth. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this, but this is to ensure that people during sort of this time of lockdown and and social change, we've changed our patterns of movement, how often we get out and about in the community. We're all sitting more, right, in front of our screens. And this LumaHealth app is a public-private partnership with the Singapore government and Apple, so that, the Apple Watch, to encourage people to get up and move and to, take greater control or agency over their fitness, their physical health, which of course is going to impact their mental health. And I think this is a really interesting deployment of technology during a really tricky time, because it's intended to address an unknown consequence of being in a pandemic, right? And because Singapore has a greater degree of trust in terms of the community's trusting and acceptance of the government's use of technology, we're seeing an uptake of this technology without any issues, along with an uptake of all the other technologies. And yet here we are in Australia with a different Western democratic view, which, I support. This is, I live here and I have these values, and I appreciate privacy from that normative perspective. But quite right, Lani, it's so interesting if we think about what could be done if we weren't as fearful of technology. But I don't think it's so much the fear of the technology. I really think it's the fear people have of their governments and some of those private sector companies, your data giants, Apple, Google, Microsoft, etc. People are concerned about what they're going to do with their data too.
Right, well, here's another thought exercise, right? So I spoke about the one I had last week with someone around the actual technology enabling the restriction of COVID spreading or even the elimination. From a privacy perspective, as a privacy specialist, Nicole, as a thought exercise, what would be, if we could apply the requisite level of privacy controls, policies, etc., what would be required in order for us to use these technologies in a safe, in a way that people could, engender trust in the government and the private, partners that government have? Because I don't think they could do this themselves.
Sometimes I think it is just one big massive comms exercise. And I'm not being glib when I say that. I think that transparency and true accountability when it comes to what happens to people's personal information in the context of their government use or any public-private partnerships, that visibility, that accountability, that ongoing community engagement and awareness, I think that is such a key in terms of building trust over time. But I don't think it's a thing that you can sort of snap your fingers or flip a switch and have it happen overnight. I think it's taken a long time to grow public mistrust. And therefore, I think that it's also going to take a long time in order to, grow the converse, which is increased public trust in our public institutions.
There's quite an irony. So I was going to say, there's just quite an irony that most people have got their location services on all their phones. They've got Facebook on all the time, Instagram, taking photos with geolocation, blah, blah, blah. Every photo that's stored in the Apple cloud has exactly where that photo was taken, the time it was taken. And yet there's this outcry around something that's designed to keep us safe.
I often wonder if that is about people feeling like they have a choice. And I think, Nicole, what you just mentioned around the comms exercise, I actually think the person that's providing that communications is equally as important. Something I've observed, and I definitely don't want to make this political because it's obviously not so much what we're here to talk about, but I think generally speaking, this is probably true of a lot of countries, but in Australia, I feel like a lot of people are losing trust in the government doing what they say they're going to do. And kind of feeling like either of our major parties is just sort of picking the best of the worst option. And I think we're seeing that because of minor parties starting to win more seats and things like that. People actually want some change. I kind of feel like the government could pull it off if they can make it not about politics for 5 minutes. And as I said, I don't want to make this into a political rant, but I think the organisations that provide this information and who provide the accountability makes a massive difference, because every day this last week you've had some politician in court or ICAC or there's not a huge amount of trust instilling activity going on, and certainly not a perceived degree of transparency. So I think who provides that messaging makes a massive difference too, because they probably want to believe it, but depending on who that's coming from, they might not.
That's a good point. Yeah, that is a good point. In terms of, even if we could get this massive, let's call it a marketing campaign, communications plan going, you're right. It's just the distrust of the government and its supporting organisations. But even and I'll throw this one out there again, from a technology perspective, Nicole, if there was some way that we could tag every piece of data that, let's say, that was collected about myself, and that you could trace this data flow as it goes through, to the state government, federal government, to any private sort of operator. Do you think that would help in terms of engendering trust and getting people, at ease, that you could trace your data flow and perhaps even control where it goes?
Oh, I think that's wonderful. And I know of some companies that are working on or have produced solutions similar to what you're talking about. Here in Australia, a colleague of mine named Joanne Cooper has a company called ID Exchange. And the premise is that we have agency of our own data, and that we know what's happening to it from, the start of its journey with a particular company or government through to the time that it's finished, that it's deleted or it's no longer useful. And I think this is a very powerful thing for the community, to have that ability to measure and control what's happening to their data. The challenge with this, and the only one that our main one that I see, is that not everyone has the same degree of literacy in relation to their data. So there are vulnerable members of the community, there are children, there are the elderly, there are people perhaps with some kind of cognitive impairment who, need access to the same services, but maybe don't have the ability to understand that they can trace what's happening to their data or what it means. And so this is a thing that I think is really important as well, that there's that education piece. But I guess conceptually and in principle, I think absolutely, Lani, the idea that we need to move to a space where there is a degree of data agency, and that my identity and what's known about me is actually mine. And I'm in control of that in terms of my relationships with my government and private sector. I think that would have an enormous impact on the community.
Great. And what about the, I don't know enough about the Privacy Act to know how strong its controls are around what organizations can collect. Because one of the challenges I find, and this is particularly when it comes to private corporations, is that the amount of information they collect for a given task far outweighs their task, right? And if you're a private corporation, it's like, well, it's best if I collect as much as I can, and then I can mine that data for the use cases and blah blah blah, enrich it, etc., with other sets of data. Are the controls in the Privacy Act strong enough to restrict corporations from doing that? Like only collect what they need for a given task or what they've sought consent for?
So depending on what you collect will determine whether you need consent or not. So there's specific types of personal information called sensitive information that you need consent before you collect it. But generally speaking, when an organization or a government collects personal information, and even whether you're dealing with the federal privacy law or the state-based privacy laws for our state governments and local governments, there are principles that specifically limit collection of personal information. So some of the principles are worded as in you only collect the personal information you need for a specific purpose, or in some cases they might use different language. But the point here is you need to know what your purpose is, and then you need to decide what personal information is required to fill that purpose, and you don't collect anything outside of that. But I agree, the challenge is that we're collecting, even if you look at forms, most forms we have to fill out, to access services from a bank or from a government department or, whomever, to buy a new car. Some of the data fields there are ridiculous for the purpose. And so what we're being asked to provide is because it's useful or potentially expedient for that organization, not that it's actually necessary to fill that particular purpose.
Yeah.
Nicole, is GDPR used as a reference point much in Australia? Because that's probably one of the most stringent data protection laws or set of principles.
No, GDPR is starting to be seen as a very relevant global benchmark in terms of what should be required in terms of privacy. But the way Australian privacy law works is that, private sector organizations in Australia apply that law. They might apply GDPR if they provide services or goods to people in the EU.
Right.
So there may be kind of a duality there, but primarily our companies are required to comply with our law. And if they're dealing in the EU, they would be required to comply with EU law. I think what's great is where you have that crossover, you see Australian companies having to lift their game a little bit, right? So that's a benefit.
Yeah, I mean, we as a UK company, we're originally a UK company, and when GDPR came in, it was a massive headache for us. But the reasoning behind it's really sound, and it's touched on a lot of the points we've mentioned. Data minimalization, purpose limitation, and transparency. I think the problem is that the people on the street, you're talking about messaging that hasn't come through. It's just another layer of people see it as another layer of bureaucracy as opposed to what it's there for.
I think another thing, and Dani will certainly have experienced this, is that often when we talk about privacy in the context of technologies and deployments of technologies, whether it's in relation to COVID or whatever, we don't often think about those other principles like collection minimization, right? We often go straight to security, don't we, Dani? We go to, oh, no, it's okay, we've got this. We've got a security plan in place.
Yeah, what I've actually observed is like a huge spectrum, and generally organizations are on one end or the other. Very rarely are people okay.
Sorry, Dani, you've cut out then.
She might be having NBN issues in Melbourne.
I was working with, we were collecting no personal data whatsoever. The risk. Hello? I'm here, I promise.
Oh, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I'm sure that was a very relevant point, but we lost it.
It just came up and said your internet connection.
Yes.
That's all right. The internet connection came up and said it was unavailable, and then I went, okay, right, hopefully we're okay. Yes, the other. And I was working with a council recently where they, well, not that recently, but 6 months ago or so, they basically had all this paperwork that had to be done just to ensure that we weren't collecting any private information and what we would do about it. And even though there was nothing identifiable in what we were doing, they insisted on running this whole process, which was a real pain in the bum. But I was actually really kind of surprised, I suppose, at the level of governance. And security, of course, was part of the conversation, but they had quite a structured governance framework, which I think was really nice because, I mean, there were a larger council, so that wasn't hugely surprising. And they actually had a dedicated privacy officer, which again is not hugely surprising when they're large. But that was one of the more mature. The only other places I've seen that is sort of banking and insurance and those sorts of places. But often you get those that go, okay, why don't we just collect whatever we can and we'll use what we need? That tends to be a common approach. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't think through the privacy and security implications, but their attitude is more about, we'll gather what we can and we'll work out what we need, which, you know, challenges you in a number of ways about volumes of data in privacy respects. And I must say, I don't know, you guys may have all experienced this in your life. The amount of times I've gone shopping or whatever, and it's a, do you want to join the club? And if it's a brand I like, sure, but you almost have to give your blood type and your mother's maiden name just to sign up to a freaking mailing list. It's, you know, I joke about the blood type thing quite regularly. I mean, the only time, you know, there's been good reason to ask those sorts of questions is if you go through like a security clearance or something. But most other times you go, why do you care where I was born? Like, I want to join your mailing list to get cheaper jeans. Like, you know, it's just, for me, it's really disconnected about what the purpose of collection is versus what they ask.
Yeah, sorry, Dani. I think that's, yeah, exactly what Nicole was talking about. Restriction of the data that you collect for only the purpose that you need. But I think even that, right? I mean, that is an important sort of pillar of the whole sort of privacy by design discussion. Where you design right from the outset the purpose of what the technology is and what it's going to collect, etc. And then you can restrict the type of data that you collect. But in this day and age of data analytics, etc., I've seen a lot of companies, large corporates, retailers, etc., who take the view, actually, you know what, we'll go the opposite. We'll just collect everything and then we'll put rules in that into our algorithms to actually strip out, anonymize, de-identify data, etc. Which again is something, but it's probably not the best, sort of leading practice in order to restrict that. In cyber we call it the attack surface. The amount of surface the attacker has to work within. Similar concept in privacy. If you reduce that collection, you reduce the risk of anything untoward's happening with that data.
Well, I always say to my clients, often they'll balk at the whole collection limitation thing because they see that as being a potential showstopper. And I often say to them, well, if you don't need it, don't collect it. And if you don't collect it, you don't have to secure it in accordance with the privacy law.
That's right.
So best not to have it in the first place unless it's fully required. You know what? Actually, this raises something interesting because the Canadian Privacy Commissioner a couple of months ago, when all these COVID technologies were starting to roll out, whether they were contact tracing apps or something else, and the Canadian Privacy Commissioner released a set of principles on which organizations and governments should be basing their decisions or their design for COVID-related technologies. And these principles are complementary to, and in some cases additional to, what you see in many privacy laws around the world, but it's all about making good decisions, right? So if you sort of take your privacy hat off or your security hat off for a second and you just think about, okay, are we making a good decision that's relevant for the community, that's safe for them? You ask yourself things like, is this technology necessary to serve the purpose that we want to serve? Is doing this thing actually going to give us that public health outcome that we want? Is it going to serve that need? And then you ask, well, okay, is the information that we want to collect necessary to serve the purposes of that technology? And then you ask, okay, is the privacy risk or detriment to a person proportionate to that public health need or whatever that other need is? And you just work your way through these questions, and wherever you have the answer no or maybe, you go back to the drawing board and you create something better. And I like that in terms of if you want to ensure privacy and cyber outcomes, going through a good decision-making process, a critical analysis of what you're doing is, I think, the best approach.
Yeah, but that presupposes that you have a privacy officer at the table at the beginning of a project as you're ideating it, etc. Right? Because
I don't think so. Having a privacy officer is good, but a number of businesses, won't be able to afford that, right? Or may not necessarily know that would be advantageous for them. But if you have anyone who's ever dealt in project management or strategy, sometimes even communications or legal, these are all individuals who have the ability to apply a good decision-making approach to decisions, even making it part of a project management gateway.
Because often, and I've seen this, I would say 70 to 80% of projects I've worked on, the question is asked very late in the game in terms of, okay, so we've decided to collect all this data. Here's the pilot that we've put together. Now, what privacy controls do we have to put in place? And you're right. You talk to them and you say, well, this discussion needed to happen, right back at the when the project initially was started up, because now you're trying to design privacy or even sometimes cyber into the project at a late stage. And people don't seem to understand that it actually makes it more costly, or it makes the cost of privacy more expensive for them.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It becomes like a,
So I was going to say, to flip that round a bit. I mean, I would. One of the things I'm guessing, assuming that's been a big part of any conversation with regard to COVID apps is the privacy issue. I mean, it's been front page headlines as much as anything else. But what those kind of questions haven't been kind of answered with a public, I haven't seen as much. They've been answered in public. So, what are the risks of if your data's breached with a COVID tracing app? Does that mean that someone can see where you are and go and rob your house, or does it just mean that someone knows that you were in a restaurant 2.5 weeks ago? If the risks are really put plain and in everyone's face, then surely, as a grown-up, people would be able to make a balanced decision about that. And then taking that a step further, if the risks seem relatively low, then that's a better mandate for a government to say, guys, everyone needs to download this to make everyone safe.
I think that that comes back then to, what's collected, where's it stored, how's it stored? Because, if there's a big database of everywhere I've been for the last year, my phone knows that now. So, this isn't new. But if that were, if somebody got hold of a pattern of my behavior, now they know where I'm going to be every Tuesday, for example. I think it actually has different implications. And something quite a while ago I was going to mention was the one that always gets me is that people always ask for dates of birth. Now, if you have my name and my date of birth, the amount of things that you can prove you're me to and my address, for example. That's the 3 basic questions that most organizations ask you when you call. So, if you've got a car loan or a bank query, they're similar questions to what they're going to ask you. And the social engineering side for me is actually one of the more concerning risks, and identity fraud and those sorts of things. So to me, there's some basic stuff that people ask, like the date of birth is the best example, because for a mailing list for my favorite jean shop, they don't need my date of birth. They just want to know how old I am so they know what to sell me. And when all that data they collect about you is centralized and then breached, I guess the possible impacts of that. So both the questions really were, the specificity of what's being collected and the impacts for, identity fraud and social engineering and those sorts of things. And then the second part to it really is the collecting things that they don't need and how they store that information then, how centralized, identifiable, what have you it is.
Yeah. I think Dani pretty much summed it up. I mean, then I guess mine is a little bit more, or the concerns I have are a little bit more obtuse, and that is these kind of things are hard to roll back once they're precedent. So once these programs are like COVID safe, tracing, etc., the amount of information the government is tracking, it's very hard to roll back, right? It's like a social welfare program. It's hard to roll back once the government or even private corporations are collecting this amount of data.
And so it's interesting because for me, I have maybe it's a bit of a more fluffy and civil libertarian kind of perspective. But when I think about the risks to people with any of these technologies or applications, whether it's in relation to COVID or anything else, I don't often think first I don't think about, say, security. That's not the first place I go, because to me, that's more of a compliance thing. That's how are you going to take care of it once you have it kind of arrangement. That's certainly a very important part of privacy, but it's only one of the aspects of privacy that I'm concerned about in my work. Similarly, I don't often, I do think about it, but not as a first port of call around, okay, if you haven't built privacy in, how do you claw it back later? How do you potentially reverse a decision when the need is no longer there? So, state sanctioned surveillance during times of COVID, yes, you need to build in a time frame so that you can claw that back later. Otherwise, what you've just done is you've created a new form of surveillance for the community that's going to go on in perpetuity, right? I get that. For me, I think more around privacy interference being about failure to collect mindfully, right? Failure to collect with minimization in mind. Failure to understand your intended uses of personal information before you gather that information. Failure to put restrictions around to whom it's going to be disclosed and why. And the harms that can come out of that are things like individuals feel that their government has more awareness of who they are and what they're doing. Like to Dani's point, the more you have about me in one centralized place, even though I have it on my phone, I'm in control of it when it's on my phone. The moment you have it in your database, you use it for whatever you want. So there's that interference with my privacy in that sense. There's the decisional interference that comes with knowing I'm under surveillance if I go and I do a thing, right? So if I know that my government has rolled out a CCTV heat mapping system of some kind, I may choose not to go out for a walk anymore because I don't want my personal information gathered in that way. If you look at countries like South Korea, they've got a contact tracing system where they use credit card data as well as other data that they have about individuals to trace their movements. And the amount of things you can learn about a person just from their purchasing habits, those things could be used to actually make decisions that affect them in the community. So in some countries, if a woman who's unmarried goes into a drugstore and buys a pregnancy test, and that pregnancy test is registered as a purchase in the database, and the government has access to that, is that person going to be punished in some way in the community? Are they going to lose a degree of social credit, for example. So these are the kinds of things that I think about, almost those worst case scenarios when it comes to privacy. It's, you know, it's not intended to be a showstopper. I think it's intended mainly to provide a more holistic vision of, you know, what we're up against when we decide to look at some of these technologies.
It's quite a scary thing. I mean, you imagine looking at the Lumi Health, the app in Singapore, and you know, credit card data, for example. You know, we're all health insurance driven in Australia. I mean, you imagine the insurance companies get hold of your purchasing history, your fitness trackers, you know, all this kind of thing. Suddenly someone's going to be refused an operation because they're buying cigarettes, or you know, they weren't using their health app enough. I mean, that's where it gets the Orwellian 1984 scenario coming out.
I think that's actually partly why a lot of people had an issue with the MyGov records, wasn't it? To do with people's concern around health records and the impact on insurance and those sorts of things. And again, you know, to your point earlier, Nicole, you know, with communication, that could have actually alleviated a lot of people's concerns or confirmed them, you know, depending on how the data is being used. And, you know, I have opted into my health record because I think there's more benefit to me than there is concern. You know, time will tell, so to speak. But, you know, a lot of people opted out of that program, which is, you know, it's concerning because they were trying to centralise health records across Australia. So, you know, wherever you went, you could get medical care and they would have access to your history. And that's really impacted the possible effectiveness of that program altogether.
You know, it's interesting about that one too. Remember, I was talking about good decision making before, kind of being a linchpin of the success of some of these projects. The whole My Health Record process was fraught because of the decision-making process. So the problem wasn't actually about the technology or its purpose or its usefulness for the community. It was to do with what legislative controls were going to be put in place and when and how effective would they be. And then how were all the people involved with this federated system going to manage risk? That, you know, in that shared risk environment, right from the technology providers down to the health service providers. And those decisions weren't made well at the outset, I don't think. And it has had, you know, quite a cascading and long-term effect now on uptake.
Guys, I think we'll take that pause as a good opportunity to bring things to a natural conclusion. I mean, I think again we've scratched the surface. We haven't even talked about other apps. Us being stuck at home and various offices on all these devices and the change in technology there as well. So maybe something to follow up on. Any final thoughts or comments?
Ross, I just want to say thank you for putting this together. I think it's just a great opportunity for, you know, for us to have, I don't know, a chinwag, right, about issues that are relevant to us in both the security and the privacy space. And it's a really great and clear recognition that these two things are really interrelated. We rarely talk about privacy without talking about cyber anymore, and vice versa. And so I feel really privileged to be here with my colleagues. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, thank you, Ross.
No, thank you, Dani, thank you, Nicole, thank you, Lani. And yeah, from my side of things, I mean, I don't know a lot about this, but it's amazing how difficult this road is that everyone's got to go down. It's only going to be more challenging from the sound of things. Well, look, guys, thank you for joining. I'll wrap this up now. I'm sure we'll be in touch and organise a follow-up. And thanks for the audience for listening and watching as well. And yeah, stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.